You're listening to Edge of Faith, a multimedia magazine where we discuss art and culture through a Christian lens. So Jonathan, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today about your new book, Political Church. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for talking about that book. It's a long, dense book, and I don't find a whole lot of people who want to talk about it, so thank you.
Well, hopefully after this interview, a lot of people will pick it up, read it, digest it, and go, hey, let's have a talk. So we shall see. So, I want to jump right in and, from the politics, I guess, that I survey on a regular basis when I was going to church before I started doing it online during the pandemic, was, I talked to a lot of my friends that are also Christians. And, I think I could pretty safely say we're of like minds theologically, or at least I think we are. But yet, when I'm talking to them, I get different feelings of what they decide is godly politics, and I'll air quote that because seems like everybody aligns God with whatever their ideology is, which frightens me.
Sure.
And what I see a lot is that they tend to fight with each other, even though we're all brothers and sisters in Christ, just over secular politics. Not even, we won't even go into church politics. So
yeah,
I try to tell them, God's not a Democrat or a Republican, or really any human ideology as far as that point goes. I'll agree with Bart that, God is God. So I was drawn by an introductory comment in your book, though, and it states that my own view is that Christians should not be beholden to any one ideology, since doing so invariably leads to idolatry. And then I'll have to say amen to that, but I would like it, baby, if you could break down that statement for the listener and then maybe give them a high-level idea of the purpose of the book, Political Church.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. Thank you. It's an ideology is a way of seeing the whole world in political terms, you might say. It's a political worldview. It's what you use to define justice and right and wrong, and what governments should do and how people should live. So it's another way of talking about worldviews, but you might say in a political idiom is what that word ideology is useful for. And if your the kind of big ideologies that people think about, David Koyzis, for instance, talks about this in his book, Political Visions and Illusions. The big ones we tend to think of would be something like liberalism, conservatism, democratism, socialism, a more strong version of that, Marxism, and maybe a couple others I'm not thinking of. And those ways of seeing the world, liberalism, conservatism / Republicanism, socialism, those ways of viewing the world have a beginning point. They have something that defines what justice is, what is just, what is not just. And if your political worldview, if your ideology, I'm speaking to fellow Christians now, doesn't begin with King Jesus, I'm going to say it's going to morph pretty quickly into an idolatry, or frankly, it already is an idolatry, right? A Christian's political perspective, I argue in the book, begins with this phrase: Jesus is King. He's King of Kings, Lord of Lords. He possesses all authority in heaven and on earth. Pilate would have no authority. Pontius Pilate would have no authority if it weren't given to him from above, says Jesus. Psalm 96:10, say among the nations, not just Israel, say among the nations, the Lord reigns. He will judge the peoples with equity, right? So for a Christian, we have to begin with this basic claim: Jesus is King, Jesus is Lord over everything. Not just the private parts of our lives, but all of our lives, right? there is no distinction between public and private with God. He owns it all. Now, I'm not saying I believe in the merging of church and state. That's a different conversation. God gives one authority to the church, gives another authority to the state. I'm not saying we should enforce Christianity. I'm not saying we should prosecute people who don't believe Jesus rose from the dead. I'm not calling for Christendom in the older sense of it that occupied Europe for so many years. So I do want to maintain a distinction between church and state. So religion and politics, well, that's a different idea. And those are overlapping ideas. And our politics is invariably religious. And our religion, whether our religion is Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, secularism, stock market, hockey, whatever, our religion invariably has political demands on each of our lives. So yes, begin with the idea that ideologies, your political worldviews, are inherently religious, and insofar as they don't begin with the idea that Jesus is king, they are idolatrous. I've been babbling for a little while here, Michael, so I don't know if you want to interrupt. I can describe the whole book, but that's sort of the starting point.
Absolutely.
Of how I enter this conversation.
Yeah, and that's a good place to start, and a good place for people to start to focus their minds, maybe pray about some of those things. But in the book, you mentioned two big concepts that Christians need to understand. Well, really, I think probably everybody should understand. And that's one, what is politics? And the other is, what is an institution? And whether that whether an institution's good or bad, right? So, in fact, it seemed to be important enough for you that you dedicated, those two chapters were about a fourth of the book. So I thought it would be good to at least get a brief understanding of those concepts, because we won't have time to get into every detail, but it's fascinating, and people can pick up the book if they want to know more. But maybe we could start off with what is politics?
Yeah, sure. Believe it or not, that's a pretty contested question, because you have two fundamental ways of defining the topic in America, in Europe, in the world, really, right now. You have a narrow way of defining the term that you get with the democratic liberal tradition, in which politics simply refers to, I'm doing this off the top of my head. I know I gave a better definition in the book, but it was something about those areas of our lives which, pertaining to governing institutions over, the whole of a society, right? So any conversations about government and laws and those kinds of institutions that regulate and seek to do justice over the whole of a society with coercive power, right? That's politics. The coercive power is essential because, the church doesn't possess coercive power, so we don't typically think of the church as being political, and it's got to be over the whole of a society. So it's not just, the president over a corporation, and the people who work for that corporation. It's over the whole of society. So within its boundaries, politics pertains to those things affecting our decisions that are about justice and are backed up by coercive power. So parts of our lives pertain to politics, and other parts, art, romance, singing, music, dance, religion, those aren't political. Okay, that's the way in the liberal Western tradition we've wanted to define politics in that narrow sense. Yet, there's a second way, a much broader way, and here you could look at civil rights movement, and especially emerging out of the civil rights movement, identity politics in general. You could look at feminist theorists, you could look at minority rights activists, you could look at the whole LGBT tradition, you could look at certainly more of a Marxist approach to defining politics, in which politics is total. It's our entire lives. Everything is political, right? And the reason, so look at your typical, feminist, even feminist thought from the 70s and 80s. Feminist writers would say things like, look, those things that affect me and my body as a woman, you're calling private. Yet those things affecting me and my body as a woman or a minority rights husband, affecting me and my skin color, you're calling that private stuff, but really those things dramatically impact our lives. Plus the fact that you're pushing them into the quote unquote private sphere means you're making a political decision. So, they used to talk about things like, say, marital rape. Why is marital rape a private thing? This profoundly impacts me. This belongs in the public, right? And what kind of developed through all of this is a broader tradition of talking about politics, which, as I said, is sort of our whole lives are political because they depend upon the decisions about ordering and regulating our society. They depend on what's just and what's not just, and they and of course everything in the so-called private sphere is only in the private sphere because somewhere publicly somebody made the decision that's private, not public, which itself is a political decision. Right? So you have two different ways of talking about politics, and those two different ways really do animate so much of the controversy. You talked about the controversy of Christians kind of tearing each other up, and I think that's right, because you have one set of Christians and churches saying, hey, let's not talk politics, let's preach the gospel. But then you have another set of Christians saying, well, no, that gospel you're preaching has political implications in all of my life. So, yes, preach the gospel, but the gospel has broad political implications. So we got to talk about those too as a matter of obedience and repentance.
Right.
So, the bottom line is, I think you have to do justice to both conversations. I think you have to acknowledge the ways in which politics is this narrow sphere of decisions of governance. But especially as Christians, when we say Jesus is king, what are we saying he's king over? Go back to my first answer. King over everything.
Absolutely.
There's a sense in which we, as Christians, have to say everything's political, because Jesus is king over everything. Yet at the same time, we recognize that Jesus doesn't exercise his kingship over everything in the same way. And so we have to pay attention to those distinctions. So look, it's an academic book that you're asking about, so I'm giving you a long, complex answer here to the whole politics thing. But I think we have to do justice to both sides of that conversation. That's the bottom line takeaway from all of that. On the question of institutions, I spent after talking about how Christians tend not to know how to think institutionally. We only tend to think in terms of Go ahead.
Yeah, let's get to the institution in a second. So I want to, since as you mentioned, it is an academic book. It's still not too bad of a read though, so I don't want people to be scared of reading an academic book. But
no, that's right.
But
all right, read it.
But I also wanted to clarify, because you went through a whole litany of different subjects that people instantly start thinking talking points. When you were talking about women's rights in the 70s and 80s, and all the other things. In that conversation, it's kind of assumed that people understand once something's public, that means it's political, versus when it's private, it's not, correct? Because I know a lot of people, once they hear certain key words, they're not thinking as clearly. So public means it goes into the political sphere, right?
Well, in one tradition, in the kind of liberal tradition, yes, that's how people understand it. That's exactly right.
And when you get into all of those pieces, and correct me again if I'm wrong with this, spiritual versus political and public versus private. But as I was reading through that, it kind of rang to me of subjective versus objective truth when you're reading a philosophy book. Is that we've kind of relegated things that are spiritual, and whatever religion you are, that's your private life, and it's subjective for you. So those are your truths. And then the politics or the public sphere is what affects all people. And that's what gets me more frightened now is, it started that way, and now it's like all the people in the church seem to think the same way. So even though, as you were mentioning, someone's at the pulpit teaching, they're going, well, that's still political, and they get flustered by it. So how does all that work?
Yeah, you're in super deep water here. So do you want to talk about what's going on in the public square, or do you want to talk about what's going on in the church? If you're talking about the public,
go ahead. No, I was just going to say, if you could briefly touch both, that'd be great.
Okay, public square. So Senator Dianne Feinstein is on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and she's speaking to a judicial nominee, federal court nominee, Amy Barrett, who's a Roman Catholic, and Senator Feinstein says to Roman Catholic federal court nominee Amy Barrett, "Your dogma lives loudly within you." That was Feinstein, Senator Feinstein's way of objecting to the conservative Amy Barrett as a potential judge. She says your dogma, meaning your religious dogma, lives loudly within you. She didn't like the idea that Amy Barrett had conservative political ideas that she thinks she got from her Roman Catholicism. And so she, Feinstein, wants to erect a barrier in her mind between church and state by saying, look, you can't go into the court and rule on behalf of your Roman Catholic dogma, right? So that was basically her argument. Well, what's the response to Senator Feinstein? Your dogma doesn't live loudly within you, Senator? What am I getting at there? Everything we do when we step into the public square, whether we're voting on abortion or same-sex marriage or healthcare or federal funding for national parks, everything we do has a conception of justice behind it. And what's behind that conception of justice? A God. Some God, a big G God, a little g God, a God we know is there, a God we don't know, an idol, right? In other words, you cannot step into the public square and play neutral between different religions. It is, I'm not saying we shouldn't, I'm saying it's impossible, right? So when we talk about the public square, the first thing I try to do in this book is to sort of pull back the curtain and say, folks, this ain't neutral, religiously neutral. You are acting on behalf of your religions, whether you say so or not. Let's just call it for what it is. Okay, so the public square, the political place, is inherently religious. That's one thing I say. But now let's travel over to the church. Let's go to the preacher in his pulpit. Is he? We think that's the domain of religion. But am I saying he's also being political? Well, it depends on how you're using the word political, to go back to the two ways we can use that word. In a narrow, pertaining to the systems of government way, no, I'm not saying he's necessarily political when he preaches Jesus is Lord. He's stating his doctrine. He's not saying what government policy should be on healthcare, government policy should be on immigration or tax reform or any number of these things. Nor should a preacher do that, I don't think. The Bible doesn't authorize a pastor to do that. But is that pastor being political in another sense, in the broader sense? Well, yes, absolutely. He's declaring Jesus as king over everything, including over Senator Feinstein and Amy Barrett and Donald Trump and Joe Biden and the Supreme Court and you and me and our school superintendents and the mayor and the garbage man, right? So there's a sense in which when a pastor steps into the pulpit, he is making an inherently political speech. There's a sense when you share the gospel with your non-Christian neighbors and you say, hey, Jesus is Lord, repent and believe. Like Jonah before the city of Nineveh, you are calling them to radically change their lives and follow after a different king. You are making, in your evangelism, a kind of political speech. But again, that's caveat, asterisk. I'm using the word political there in a different, broader sense. And so we need to be careful about how we're using these different terms.
It gets complicated quickly, doesn't it?
Oh my God! Oh yeah, it does. I've spent years thinking about this, and sometimes I'm still befuddled.
So, I would say now that we have, I wouldn't say that we have a handle on politics, but now that we have a little bit of a flavor of what politics is, maybe we can move on to what is an institution. And, once again, as I first started to read that chapter, I was entertained by one of your quotes, which is, I will argue that we need to learn how to read the Bible institutionally. Because that might not seem like a big deal, but as you start to read the book and understand where people come from in regards to institutions in the church, those were fighting words. So perhaps you could break some of this down and explain what an institution is?
Yeah, sure. And I'm saying a lot of this, the context from that chapter and from my saying this is that we live in an anti-institutional age where people like organic. They like what's natural. We tend to think institutions are bad. I don't want institutionalized religion. I want the real thing. I want a relationship, right? And so the point of that chapter is to step back and say, well, hold on, what exactly is an institution? Well, an institution is you might say, identity and behavior shaping rule structure. Identity and behavior shaping rule structure, or just to narrow it down to two words, a rule structure. In that sense, an institution is both, you can have very informal, everyday institutions, and you can have big, elaborate institutions. A handshake is an institution. It's a rule structure that dictates. So if you and I bumped into each other right now, Michael, and these weren't COVID times, the ordinary practice for you and me to greet one another would be to extend our hands, embrace hands, kind of shake them a couple of times, but not too hard, not too soft. That's a rule structure governing how we interact as two people greeting one another, right? A relay race, that's an institution. Congress, that's a big elaborate institution. It's many rules determining who can do what and say what authorities they have and when, right? Insurance is an institution. A holiday is an institution. A mortgage is an institution. Our lives are necessarily governed by institutions, by these rule structures, which keep us from living in complete and total chaos. And so what that means is when people say, I don't like institutions, I'm anti-institutional, what are they really saying? They're really saying, I don't like your rule structures, and I prefer my own rule structures. It's impossible for a community of people to live apart from institutions, because institutions regulate our behavior. They afford predictability to our actions. They even give meaningfulness, value to our interactions. They say, hey, this holiday is worth celebrating. That one isn't. They say, hey, this is a nice way to greet people, and this is not a nice way to greet people. So our moral valuations are all embedded inside of our institutions, and that's why life is inescapably institution. Let me put it this way. Even a society of perfect beings, a society of angels, are going to have a set of rules, a set of structures, a set of institutions that govern how they live with respect to one another. So it's not are institutions good or bad, it's which institutions are you going to live by. That's the only question. So yeah, I'm trying to give a little bit more intelligence and thoughtfulness to how we approach this whole topic of institutions. Now, when I talk about reading the Bible institutionally, instead of reading through the Bible and just being like, okay, what is God requiring of me, which is a good question to ask, I also want to ask the question, what is God requiring of us? How do we live together as the people of God? And therefore, as we read through the Bible, the question we want to ask is, who has God authorized to do what? That's the key question in an institutional hermeneutic. The key question we should all be asking when we read the Bible, as it were, institutionally. Who has God authorized to do what? What did he authorize Adam and Eve to do? Well, be fruitful and multiply. What did he authorize Noah to do? Well, build an ark. What did he authorize governments to do in Genesis 9? To whoever sheds the blood of man shall by man shall his blood be shed. What did he authorize Moses to do? And David, and then eventually Jesus, and finally the church. What does he authorize the church to do? So as you and I, let me make this real practical real fast. Hey, how should I vote? Who should I vote for? Well, question one, what does God authorize governments to do? I want to make sure I vote for the party or for the candidate who is seeking to do things, who has a party platform that's closest to doing or seeking to do what God has authorized governments to do. Now, here's another super practical question. Hey, what should churches do when they gather? Well, let's stop and ask. What has God authorized churches to do? What can a pastor tell me and not tell me? Well, let's ask. What has God authorized pastors to do? And so on and so forth. We could go through all the different institutions that make up society: parents, family, husbands and wives, being citizens of a nation. In each case, we want to go through the Bible and ask the question, who has God authorized to do what?
That's sounds like it would make it a lot more simple. Hopefully it does. If people all practice that would be wonderful.
It's a step.
It's definitely a start. Absolutely. This in the next issue of Edge of Faith, or special editions, all about the history of the people of God and dealing with secular politics and the church. And so this question may not be exactly in the book, but hopefully you can give us some insight on it. I'd like your thoughts on how politics and faith presented themselves during the Old Testament. Briefly, then maybe jump to the first century, and then finally tell us what it would mean for us today. Although I guess you kind of have told us some of what we have today, so that's a short question, right? So long answer.
In some ways, I'm going to fall back on some of the things I've already said. Insofar, our faith necessarily has a political dimension, because think about the concepts of worship and politics. They both begin. Let me put it this way: they both begin with you bowing. What do you do when you worship? You bow before God. What do you do before a king? You bow, right? So the concept of faith and worship is inherently political. So we can talk about the Old Testament, we can talk about the first century, we can talk about today. In all three of those locations, and anywhere else you want to look, I'm saying, okay, what are those people ultimately bowing down to? What are they saying gives their lives meaning, value, hope, salvation, redemption? What do they worship? Because that is where you're going to find their politics. That's where you're going to find what they use to define right and wrong, just and unjust, how to live individually and how to live collectively, right? So worship is always the starting point of our politics. I wrote another book recently called How the Nations Rage, Rethinking Faith and Politics for a Divided Age, which is more of a popular level book. And the chapter 1 is politics begins with our religion. Governance begins with our worship. Now, specifically, what distinguishes those different ages, kind of getting more to your question, is the different governing systems in play in those moments. So if we're talking about the Old Testament, we have to pay close attention. You have several stages. So what was life like in the garden? What was life out of the garden in those early days? Time of Noah, table of nations in chapter 10 of Genesis, and then getting into the patriarchal era of Israel, where the family father is sort of the lead political figure. The Abraham figure is as a nomadic people. That's kind of your governing structure. But then by the time you get to Israel, or Egypt, and then out of Egypt and into Israel, well, then you have the formation of a nation state, and God eventually moves to using a kingship, right, for expressing both political rule and the means through which the people would worship. So the Bible uses a number, and then eventually into exile, right? So now there they are in Assyria, and there they are in Babylon, and the people are still trying to find ways to worship. Think of Daniel praying towards, and open his window, praying in the direction of Jerusalem. But it's still, at the same time, he's living under a pagan king. And Jesus comes along and says, "Render to Caesar what is Caesar, and to God what is God." Well, at that point, Jesus isn't saying Caesar is outside of God's domain. That's not what he means. But he is saying you have to acknowledge Caesar, even though Caesar doesn't necessarily acknowledge me in all of your worship, right? So the Bible uses a host of different political structures. One side lesson is that, I wouldn't say that any particular political structure is sacrosanct. The Lord is happy to use, as it were, any political structure. His interest is in questions of righteousness and justice. And so whether I'm living in a monarchy, I'm living as a nomadic tribe, or I'm living in a democracy, God is most interested in hearts that trust him and that are walking in righteousness and justice. And so that's what we need to seek to do. Jumping today, what does faith mean in our politics? Well, it's sort of the same thing. Here we are living in a democracy. I'm seeking to obey Jesus as Lord in all of my life. So when I step into the voting booth, I'm asking the question, A, what has God authorized government to do? Okay, we talked about that before. Has he authorized government to redefine marriage? And B, I'm asking the question, what does God say is just or not just? So a Maryland state ballot measure is asking me to increase the number of state lottery slots from 15,000 to 16,500. Is that a just thing? Adding more state lotteries, which I personally think tends to afflict and hurt poor people, I don't think it is just, according to God's understanding of what justice is. So yeah, my faith necessarily informs my politics, albeit through a democratic mechanism today. Last point to make in all of this. Again, I want to mark off the church as a distinct institution from the state. God has not, he has authorized, let me put it this way, he's authorized the state with the sword, he's authorized the church with the keys. So when I step into the ballot box, I'm not seeking to wield the keys of the kingdom. Those have been given to the church. When I step into the ballot box, I'm not seeking to define doctrine, nor should I. I'm not trying to determine who is a member of the church and who is not, in the way Christendom that happened. Likewise, when I step into the church, I'm not wielding the sword, right? I'm not seeking to impose my view of who Jesus is on the whole of society. The church simply has the authority of the keys to define the who and the what of the gospel. Who are the saints? What is the gospel? That's the church's job. And I need to say all of that distinction between church and state, Michael, because of everything else I'm saying about the inescapably religious nature of our politics. Right.
And I think you definitely got to the point of what my question was, which is really, the church is political. It's a kingdom. And all through the ages, not just this current time period, we've always had to struggle, sometimes more, sometimes less, with the secular politics versus what our worldview is.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right.
And so I guess that I'm suggesting we have hope that we can get through this, because it just seems so polarizing and divisive. I mean, you would think that you could go to church and at least escape that, but you can't. So,
well, the key. Let me throw this in there. The key for maintaining unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace in the church, I think, has a lot to do with Romans 14 and Christian freedom. Recognizing that we're going to make different wisdom-based political judgments, and allowing brothers and sisters to make different kinds of political judgments than we ourselves are making. We're united in the gospel. We're united in what's clear and explicit in Scripture. But when it comes to the political judgments we make, not all political judgments, but many of them, tax reform, immigration, healthcare, these kinds of things, most of these are what I've called jagged line issues, where we should allow brothers and sisters in Christ to disagree with one another, and we forbear with one another in a Romans 14 sort of way, even if you feel really strong about something. There's only a few political issues that are what I call straight line issues, or actually a guy named Robert Benet has called straight line issues, straight line between the biblical text and the policy application, as opposed to a jagged line between the biblical text and the policy application. There's only a few issues that are quote-unquote straight line issues where we would bind the conscience. So, for instance, I would say abortion, that's a straight line issue. Racism, it's a straight line issue. And so there's a few that we would bind the conscience on, but most we need to allow one another to disagree with one another and continue to come to the Lord's table together, even though we don't agree on a lot of these political things.
Yeah, I mean, even just praying together, even if we about the issue, even if we have different opinions about it.
No, that's exactly right.
So I guess we're coming up closer to the end. I wanted to bring the point that the political church has so much more in it even than what we talked about. It's got a chapter on the politics of creation, of the fall, the new covenant, and a large section on the politics of the kingdom, which we touched on. Everybody should pick up a copy and be more informed. Now, I know earlier on you gave me the option to let you talk about the whole book, which I'd love to, but we probably don't have time. But I would love for you to at least give your final thoughts on where we should go from here.
Yeah, sure. The final chapter, which the whole book is heading towards, is on the local church as an embassy of Christ's rule. And really, what I'm trying to do in this book is build up what's called a political theology from the ground up, right? What is a biblical political theology? How do we theologize about the whole realm of politics? And at the very center of a biblical political theology in this day and age, I'm saying, is the local church. And those churches, what are they? They are embassies, outposts of Christ's rule on earth. If you've been overseas and visited, say, the American embassy in Brussels or London, you walk up and there's a flag flying out in front, and there's an American soldier standing out front, and then you walk inside and they look at your passport and they say, here's American soil when you walk into that embassy. And, if you're to go to American embassy dinner, you're going to have burger and fries and, kind of American cuisine there at the embassy dinner or whatever. People are going to speak English, American accented English. It's going to all feel very American, even though there you are in London or Nairobi or Brussels or Tokyo or whatever, right? What is the local church? Well, it's where you go to hear the declarations and judgments of heaven on earth declared. This is the gospel. This is the King. It's where you taste the cuisine of heaven in the Lord's Supper. It's where you hear the accent of heaven and how we love and encourage one another and correct one another when necessary. It's where the culture of heaven begins to take shape and manifest itself as we demonstrate the fruit of the Spirit and so forth. So at the very center of our view of politics as Christians, I am saying, is healthy, Bible-preaching, gospel-believing local churches, where we are affirming one another as citizens of the kingdom of heaven, first and foremost. Even before we're American or Nigerian or Kenyan or Chinese, we are citizens of Christ's kingdom. And we are learning in the local church to live by his rule in all of life and encouraging one another to do the same. And it's as we develop that life of politics in ourselves and that life of justice in our congregations that it then should spill outward in our engagement with the culture. So if you're not loving your own house, don't talk to me about loving in my house. All right? If you're not parenting your own kids well, don't come to me and tell me how to parent my kids. Oh, hey Christians, if you guys aren't, caring for the elderly and the young and the hurting and the defenseless and living just and righteous lives inside of your own walls, why should I listen to you as you engage culture? To think of Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous, I Have a Dream speech where he's talking about little black boys and girls sitting down with little white boys and girls. If that's not happening first in the church, what exactly is it that we have to commend to the nation, right? So, yeah, but my final thought, Michael, would be look to your church. Look to loving other brothers and sisters in Christ in your congregation. That's the beginning of politics. Right there.
Well, amen to that. That's a great leaving thought. I mean, it's, I can't remember if it was in your book or one of the others that I've read recently, but it definitely hit the same point, is that the church, or the people in the church, have bought into so much of postmodernity and secularism, and they've brought that to the church, that if you can't recognize anything different from the way the church reacts to the way the secular world reacts, then we aren't marked as different. The first century church, Rome wasn't too fond of them because it was against their polity, and people were willing to be torn apart by lions and seemed to be happy about it. And that was something that people hung to and went, wow, there must be something to this, because look at the convictions and look at how different they think than we do, right? And we need to bring that back to society today where we are different, and people can see that, as you mentioned.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
Well, sir, it's a great book. Everybody needs to pick up a copy. Once again, Political Church, InterVarsity Press. Thanks for taking the time to share so many of your ideas and thoughts. It was wonderful. So thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Michael. Good to be with you.